The morning air in Dallas carried the scent of gunpowder and determination as hundreds of competitors gathered for the annual International Sniper Championship. Among the sea of camouflage and tactical gear, Sergeant First Class Rebecca Martinez stood out, not because she wanted to, but because she was one of only 6 women in a field of nearly 200 shooters. Rebecca adjusted the strap on her rifle case, her calloused fingers betraying years of military service that had ended 18 months ago. Fort Bragg felt like a lifetime away now, but the muscle memory remained. She'd earned her invitation to this championship through a regional qualifier, shooting circles around men who'd assumed she was there to watch her boyfriend compete. The sprawling facility outside Dallas buzzed with corporate sponsors and vendors hawking everything from custom triggers to ballistic calculators. Banners for Remington, Federal, and other major brands fluttered in the Texas breeze. The grandstands were already filling with spectators eager to witness what promised to be the most competitive championship in years. "Well, well," came a voice, dripping with condescension behind her. "Looks like they're letting anyone compete these days." Rebecca turned to see a heavy-set man in his 40s approaching, flanked by 2 younger shooters who hung on his every word like disciples. His tactical vest was adorned with patches from shooting competitions she'd never heard of, and his oversized sunglasses reflected the morning sun. "Brian Thompson," he said, extending a hand with theatrical politeness. "Local champion, 3-time, winner of the Texas Precision Shooting League." "And you are?" "Rebecca Martinez," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. His grip lingered longer than necessary, clearly meant to test her resolve. "Martinez," Brian repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. "Let me guess, you're here because some diversity program needed to fill a quota. Maybe your husband pulled some strings." Heat flashed across Rebecca's face, but years of military discipline kept her voice level. "I qualified like everyone else." Brian's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Sure you did, sweetheart. Just remember, this isn't some feel-good training exercise. This is the real deal." He gestured broadly at the range. "Men's work." The 2 younger shooters snickered, and Rebecca felt every eye in the immediate area turn toward her. Several other competitors had stopped their preparations to watch the exchange, some with obvious amusement, others with uncomfortable expressions. "We'll see," Rebecca said quietly, turning away to find her assigned preparation area. "Oh, we sure will," Brian called after her, loud enough for nearby competitors to hear. "Hope you brought your participation trophy case." The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow, but Rebecca kept walking. She'd faced worse than this in actual combat zones, much worse. At the check-in table, a range officer with graying temples looked up from his clipboard. "Name?" "Rebecca Martinez." He scanned the list, his eyes stopping with visible surprise. "You're SFC Martinez, the one from the Fort Worth qualifier?" "Yes, sir." "Heard about that shoot," he said, his tone shifting from bureaucratic indifference to something approaching respect. "Perfect score under pressure. Impressive work." It was the first kind word she'd heard all morning, and Rebecca felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you." "Don't let the peacocks ruffle your feathers," he said quietly, glancing toward where Brian was holding court. "Lots of bark, not much bite. Show them what real training looks like." Rebecca nodded, collected her competitor packet, and made her way to the practice range. The morning sun was climbing higher, and already she could feel sweat beginning to form under her tactical shirt. The humidity reminded her of training exercises in Georgia, where she'd first learned that being underestimated could be an advantage. She found an empty lane and began unpacking her Remington 700, the same rifle she'd carried through 2 deployments. Every modification, every adjustment had been earned through necessity. This wasn't some custom shop showpiece, it was a working tool that had saved lives, including her own. As she set up her shooting position, she became aware of whispers from the adjacent lanes. Fragments of conversation drifted over. Never seen a woman shoot past 800 yards. And probably just here for the publicity. Rebecca focused on her rifle, running through the familiar ritual of preparation. Check the action, verify the scope mounting, test the trigger pull. The routine was meditative, drowning out the doubt and hostility swirling around her. "Having trouble with that big rifle, miss?" came another voice, syrupy with false concern. Rebecca looked up to see a range officer approaching, not the helpful one from check-in, but a younger man whose badge read Dennis. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "No trouble," she replied. "Well, if you need any help adjusting that scope or understanding the range commands, just holler. I know military training isn't quite the same as civilian precision shooting." He paused, clearly enjoying himself. "Different standards, you know." The implication was clear. Military standards were lower, easier. Rebecca had heard this particular myth before, usually from people who'd never worn the uniform. "I appreciate the offer," she said evenly, "but I think I can manage." Dennis shrugged. "Suit yourself, just don't want anyone getting overwhelmed." On their first day, "This isn't basic training." As he walked away, Rebecca caught the smirks on the faces of nearby competitors. Word was spreading quickly. The woman was out of her depth, probably wouldn't last past the first elimination round. She chambered a practice round and settled into her shooting position. Through her scope, the target at 300 yards looked almost insultingly close. In Afghanistan, she'd regularly made shots at twice that distance under enemy fire, with mortar rounds impacting nearby and her spotter calling out wind corrections in urgent whispers. The memory brought with it a familiar weight, not just the technical challenge of long-range shooting, but the burden of lives depending on her accuracy. Here, the stakes were only pride and a trophy. In the mountains outside Kabul, a missed shot meant American soldiers going home in flag-draped boxes. Rebecca took a deep breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet punched a clean hole in the X-ring, dead center. She worked the bolt and fired again. Another X-ring hit, less than an inch from the first. The laughter and whispers from nearby lanes gradually faded as she continued her practice session, each shot landing with mechanical precision. By the time she'd finished her practice rounds, a small crowd had gathered behind her lane, watching in respectful silence. Brian Thompson was among them, his earlier smirk replaced by a thoughtful frown. Their eyes met as Rebecca stood and began cleaning her rifle, and for just a moment she saw something that might have been concern flicker across his face. Good, she thought, he should be concerned. The opening ceremony was scheduled for noon, followed by the first elimination round. Rebecca packed her gear methodically, ignoring the continued stares and whispered conversations around her. She'd proven she could shoot. Now came the hard part. As she headed toward the main pavilion, she caught sight of an older man observing from the VIP section. Unlike the other spectators, he wasn't watching the practice sessions with casual interest. His gaze was analytical, professional. When their eyes met, he gave a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgement one professional gives another. Rebecca nodded back, wondering who he was and whether he might prove to be an ally in what was shaping up to be a hostile environment. She had a feeling she'd need all the allies she could get. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as she walked toward the pavilion, but Rebecca Martinez felt a familiar calm settling over her. She'd been underestimated before, dismissed before, written off before, it never ended well for the people doing the dismissing. The opening ceremony buzzed with barely contained testosterone as nearly 200 competitors filed into the main pavilion. Rebecca found a seat toward the back, hoping to avoid attention, but she could feel eyes tracking her movement. Whispered conversations followed in her wake like smoke from a muzzle flash. The championship director, a distinguished man in his 60s, named Colonel James Harrison, took the podium. His voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded respect on actual battlefields. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Welcome to the most challenging sniper competition in the world. Over the next 4 days, you'll face tests designed to separate true marksmen from weekend warriors." Rebecca noticed how his gaze lingered on her for just a moment longer than the others, not with the skepticism she'd grown accustomed to, but with what seemed like professional assessment. "The first elimination round begins in 1 hour," Harrison continued. 300 yards, 5 shots, standing position. The bottom 20% go home. No excuses, no second chances. Brian Thompson caught her eye from across the pavilion and made an exaggerated show of checking his watch, then shaking his head with mock sympathy. His message was clear: start planning your trip home. After the ceremony, competitors spread across the multiple firing lines for the first formal round. Rebecca drew lane 47, unfortunately adjacent to Brian's position. As she set up her rifle, she could hear him holding court with a small audience of admirers. "Standing shots at 300? He scoffed loudly. "Might as well hand me the trophy." "Now, I've been shooting standing positions since before some of these kids were born." "And what about the woman?" one of his followers asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Brian's laugh was harsh. "Martinez? She'll be lucky to hit the target frame. Military training focuses on prone positions with bipods, supported shooting. This is pure marksmanship." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten, but forced herself to focus on her rifle setup. The standing position was actually her strongest, learned not in some comfortable training environment, but during urban operations where prone positions meant certain death. "Shooters, you have 10 minutes for sighting shots," announced the range officer. Rebecca's first shot landed 2 inches high and 1 inch left of center, well within the scoring rings but not where she'd aimed. She made a mental note of the wind conditions and scope adjustment needed. "Ouch!" Brian called out theatrically. "That's going to leave a mark on her confidence." Several competitors chuckled, and Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. She forced herself to ignore the taunts and focused on her second sighting shot. This one landed exactly where she'd aimed, dead center in the X-ring. The laughter died, down noticeably. "Beginner's luck," Brian muttered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Sighting period complete. Shooters, prepare for record fire." Rebecca settled into her shooting stance, rifle positioned perfectly against her shoulder. The target seemed to shimmer in the heat waves rising from the baked earth, but she'd shot in far worse conditions. The key was reading the mirage, understanding how the heat distortion affected her sight picture. "Ready on the right! Ready on the left! Ready on the firing line!" The range fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the grandstands. "Commence firing!" Rebecca's first shot broke clean, the recoil absorbed by her practiced stance. Through her scope, she could see the hole appear in the 9 ring, not perfect, but solid. She worked the bolt smoothly, chambered the next round, and settled back into position. Her second shot landed in the 10 ring, better. By her fourth shot, she'd found her rhythm. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, every movement automatic and precise. Her final shot punched through the X-ring with a satisfying smack. against the target backing. As the ceasefire was called, Rebecca lowered her rifle and glanced at Brian's target through the spotting scope. His shots were clustered in the 8 and 9 rings, respectable, but nothing spectacular. "Scores will be posted in 15 minutes, announced the head range officer. Rebecca began cleaning her rifle, a ritual that helped calm her nerves. Around her, competitors compared their performances with varying degrees of confidence and anxiety. The bottom 20% would be eliminated, roughly 40 shooters heading home on the first day. "Not bad for a beginner," came a voice behind her. Rebecca turned to see the older man she'd noticed during practice. Up close, he looked even more distinguished. Silver hair, weathered face, and eyes that had clearly seen their share of serious situations. "Thank you," she replied carefully. "Colonel David Peterson, U.S. Army, retired," he said, extending his hand. "I was watching your practice session earlier. Impressive shooting. Rebecca Martinez, nice to meet you, sir." Peterson's handshake was firm and brief, military standard. "I heard Thompson giving you grief earlier. Don't let him get in your head. I've seen his type before. Big mouth, average skills." Before Rebecca could respond, the scores were posted on the large electronic board near the firing line. A crowd gathered quickly, shooters searching for their names and elimination line. Rebecca found her name in the top 15. Brian Thompson was listed in the middle of the pack, safe from elimination, but barely. "Well, I'll be damned," Peterson murmured, studying the scores. "Looks like the old boy's in for a surprise." The elimination announcement came over the loudspeaker. "The following competitors have been eliminated from the championship. Please turn in your competitor packets at the main desk." 40 names were read. Rebecca wasn't among them. As the eliminated shooters filed out, their dreams ended for another year. Brian Thompson approached her cleaning station. His earlier swagger had been replaced by something harder to read. "Decent shooting out there, Martinez," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Thank you. Of course, the real challenges haven't started yet. Today was just basic marksmanship. Tomorrow, we get into the technical stuff, precision shooting at distance, moving targets, time pressure." His smile was thin and cold. "That's where we separate the pretenders from the real shooters." "Looking forward to it," Rebecca replied evenly. Brian's expression darkened slightly. "You know, I did some checking on you. Heard some interesting stories about your service record. Something about a mission that went sideways. Team members." "Lost?" Rebecca's hands stilled on her rifle. She'd been wondering when this would surface, the incident that had effectively ended her military career. Not through any fault of her own, but in the army, perception often mattered more than facts. "I wouldn't know anything about that," she said quietly. "No?" "Funny thing about rumors, they tend to have some truth to them. Makes a person wonder about performance under real pressure." Brian leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Makes them wonder if someone might freeze up when it really matters." The words hit like a physical blow. Rebecca felt her vision narrow, her breathing quicken. But then she noticed Colonel Peterson had drifted within earshot, his expression darkening as he caught Brian's words. "Is there a problem here?" Peterson's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Brian straightened slightly, recognizing the tone, if not the man. "No problem, Colonel. Just congratulating Ms. Martinez on making it through the first round." "I see." Peterson's gaze was steady and unfriendly. "Well, I'm sure you have preparations to make for tomorrow. Don't let us keep you." It wasn't a suggestion. Brian nodded curtly and walked away, but not before giving Rebecca one last measuring look. "See you tomorrow, Martinez." Hope you're ready for the real competition." After he left, Peterson shook his head. That boy's got a mouth that's going to write checks his shooting can't cash. He's not wrong about tomorrow being harder, Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady. No, but he's wrong about you. Peterson's eyes were kind but serious. I know talent when I see it, and I know character. Whatever happened in your past, it doesn't define what you can do here. Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest, the first genuine encouragement she'd received since arriving. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's when the real work begins. As Rebecca packed her gear and headed for her hotel, she couldn't shake Brian's words about her service record. The incident he'd referenced was classified, but rumors had a way of spreading through military communities like wildfire. She'd hoped to leave all that behind when she'd accepted the invitation to compete, but it seemed the past had followed her to Texas, carried in whispered gossip and half-truths. Tomorrow would indeed be harder. The question was whether she could shoot well enough to silence the doubts, both from others and the ones that had taken root in her own mind. The Texas evening was warm and humid as she walked to her rental car, but Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Day one was over, but the real battle was just beginning. Rebecca's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., jolting her from a restless sleep plagued by memories she'd tried to bury. The caller ID showed her former squad leader, Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez. Rebecca, Jesus, I'm sorry to call so early, but I had to warn you. She sat up in bed, instantly alert. Warn me about what? Brian Thompson contacted our old unit. He's been digging into what happened in Kandahar, asking questions about the incident. Some of the guys, they talked. Rebecca's stomach dropped. The incident. 3 years ago, a nighttime operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Not through any fault of hers, but try explaining that to people who hadn't been there. How much does he know? She asked quietly. Enough to cause problems. Rebecca, listen to me. What happened wasn't your fault. You saved more lives that night than... I know what happened, Mike. Her voice was sharper than intended. Thanks for the heads up. After hanging up, Rebecca stared at the ceiling as dawn light crept through the hotel curtains. Brian Thompson wasn't just trying to psyche her out anymore. He was actively working to destroy her reputation. The second day's events were scheduled to begin with precision shooting at 600 yards, followed by rapid-fire scenarios and moving targets. When Rebecca arrived at the range, she immediately sensed a shift in atmosphere. Conversation stopped as she passed. Eyes followed her with new intensity. Brian was already holding court near the equipment check, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. I'm not saying she can't shoot, he was saying, to a group of competitors and range officials. I'm just saying there are questions about her performance under pressure, real pressure, not range pressure. Range Officer Dennis nodded along eagerly. Military standards aren't the same as civilian precision shooting. Different skill sets? Entirely. Exactly, Brian continued. And when someone's been involved in an incident where American soldiers died because of hesitation, he let the implication hang in the air. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. Several competitors were staring at her now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. The carefully crafted lie was already spreading, that she'd hesitated, that her team had paid the price. Colonel Peterson appeared at her elbow. Ignore them, he said quietly. Focus on your shooting. But it was hard to ignore when the whispers followed her to the firing line. Range Officer Dennis seemed particularly eager to scrutinize her equipment setup, taking far longer than necessary to inspect her rifle and ammunition. "This scope mount looks loose," he announced loudly. "Safety concern. You'll need to retighten it before you can shoot." Rebecca knew the mount was perfectly secure. She'd checked it 3 times that morning, but arguing would only feed the narrative that she was difficult, unprofessional. "Of course," she said evenly, reaching for her tools. The loose mount cost her 15 minutes of preparation time and threw off her pre-shot routine. By the time she was cleared to begin the 600-yard precision round, other competitors were already finishing. "Shooter 47, you have 5 minutes sailor remaining for your 5 shots, Dennis announced, making a show of checking his stopwatch. Rebecca settled into position, her mind racing. The target at 600 yards wavered in the heat mirage, and she had to account for a quartering wind that kept shifting direction. Under normal circumstances, this would be a routine shot. But with time pressure and hostile eyes watching her every movement, even routine became challenging. Her first shot landed in the 8 ring, respectable, but not the precision she was known for. The second shot was better, finding the 9 ring, but she could feel the pressure mounting with each tick of the clock. 2 minutes, shooter 47, Dennis called out. Her third shot was rushed, landing in the 7 ring. Murmurs rippled through the spectators in the grandstand. Brian Thompson's voice carried clearly. "Cracking under pressure, just like before." Rebecca forced herself to breathe, to remember her training. In Afghanistan, she'd made shots like this with Taliban fighters actively hunting her position. A timer and some gossip shouldn't be enough to rattle her. Her fourth shot found the 10 ring. Better. 1 minute, her final shot had to count. She steadied her breathing, read the wind, and squeezed the trigger with deliberate precision. The bullet struck the X-ring with a satisfying snap. "Time!" Dennis called out. "Shooter 47, clear your weapon and step back from the line." Rebecca's final score was solid, enough to keep her in the competition, but not impressive enough to silence the doubters. As she packed her rifle, she overheard fragments of conversation from nearby competitors. Maybe the pressure stories are true. Solid shooting, but nothing special. Or Thompson might be right about her. The rapid-fire event went better. Multiple targets at varying distances, engaging each within a strict time limit. This was closer to combat shooting, and Rebecca's military training showed. She finished in the top 10, her shots consistently finding vital zones, but even success felt hollow when filtered through the lens of suspicion. Range Officer Dennis made pointed comments about adequate military marksmanship versus true precision shooting. Brian Thompson nodded along, adding his own commentary about the difference between range warriors and real-world performance. The breaking point came during the lunch break. Rebecca was eating alone at a picnic table when a young competitor approached, one of Brian's followers from the first day. His face was flushed with nervous excitement, like he was delivering a dare from his buddies. "Hey, Martinez," he said, loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "My buddy Brian wanted me to ask you something." "Oh?" Rebecca looked up from her sandwich, already dreading what was coming. "He wanted to know if you ever think about the guys who didn't make it home because you froze up over there. You know, in Afghanistan." The picnic area fell silent. Rebecca felt every eye turn toward her, waiting to see how she'd respond to this deliberate provocation. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her food. "That's not what happened," she said, quietly. "No, because Brian heard different. He heard you had a clear shot on an insurgent, and you hesitated, couldn't pull the trigger when it mattered, and because of that, 2 American soldiers died in the ambush that followed." Rebecca's vision began to narrow. The carefully constructed lie was out there now in front of dozens of witnesses, a story designed to destroy not just her reputation, but her soul. "That's not true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell us what really happened," the young man pressed, emboldened by the audience. "Prove Brian wrong," but Rebecca couldn't. The real story was classified, full of operational details she couldn't share. And even if she could, who would believe her word against Brian's sources? She stood abruptly, leaving her half-eaten lunch on the table. As she walked away, she heard the murmur of conversation resume behind her, people discussing what they'd just witnessed, drawing their own conclusions from her silence. Colonel Peterson caught up with her near the parking area. "Rebecca, wait." "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "He's destroyed my reputation before I even have a chance." "To compete? Everyone thinks I'm a coward, that I got people killed." "I don't think that," Peterson said firmly. "And I'm not the only one. There are people here who recognize real skill when they see it." "It doesn't matter. He's won. Even if I shoot perfectly from here on out, people will always wonder if I might crack under pressure." Peterson was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Can I tell you something about pressure, Rebecca? Real pressure isn't a timer or a crowd watching. Real pressure is knowing that lives depend on your next decision. I spent 30 years in the army and I can recognize someone who's been there." He paused, letting that sink in. "Whatever happened in Afghanistan, I know it wasn't cowardice. I can see it in how you handle your rifle, how you approach each shot, how you carry yourself under stress. Brian Thompson has never faced real pressure in his life. That's why he has to tear down others to feel important." Rebecca wiped her eyes, embarrassed by the show of emotion. "What am I supposed to do? How do I fight back against lies?" "The same way you've always fought back," Peterson said, "by being better than them, by showing them what real skill looks like under real pressure." As they talked, Rebecca noticed several competitors and range officials watching from a distance. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical, and a few appeared to be enjoying the drama. "Tomorrow's the long-range event," Peterson continued. 800 yards and beyond. That's where natural talent separates from weekend warrior skills. Show them what a real sniper can do." Rebecca nodded slowly. She could walk away now, drive back to her apartment, and try to forget this whole nightmare. Or she could stay and fight, not just for a trophy, but for her reputation and self-respect. The afternoon events were torture. Every shot was scrutinized, every movement dissected by hostile observers. Range Officer Dennis seemed determined to find fault with her equipment, her technique, her presence. Brian Thompson provided running commentary to anyone who would listen about military washouts and affirmative action competitors. But something had hardened inside Rebecca during her conversation with Colonel Peterson. The lies hurt, the stares stung, but she'd survived worse than bruised pride, much worse. As the second day ended and scores were posted, Rebecca found herself still in the top 20, battered and bloodied metaphorically, but still standing. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test, long-range precision shooting, where minor errors became major misses, where natural ability mattered more than politics or gossip. Brian Thompson might have won the psychological warfare battle, but the war was far from over. Standing in the hotel parking lot as the Texas sun set behind her, Rebecca made a decision. She wouldn't just compete tomorrow, she would dominate, not for the trophy or the recognition, but to honor the memory of the soldiers she'd actually saved, and to prove that some lies are too big to stand unchallenged. The real fight was about to begin. Rebecca spent the night researching, her laptop, screen illuminating the hotel room as she dove deep into competition rules, regulations, and precedents. If Brian Thompson wanted to play dirty, she needed to understand every rule he might try to manipulate and every protection the competition offered. She found it buried in Section 12C of the Championship Guidelines, Competitor Conduct Standards, specifically the clause about creating a hostile environment through harassment, intimidation, or spreading unsubstantiated claims about a competitor's background. Violations could result in immediate disqualification. More importantly, she discovered that Colonel James Harrison, the championship director, had his own distinguished military record. If anyone would understand the difference between facts and malicious rumors, it would be him. The next morning brought unseasonably cool air to the Texas range, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. Rebecca arrived early, hoping to get some practice time before the long-range events began. She found Colonel Peterson already at the 800-yard line, methodically adjusting his scope. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, without looking up. "Something like that." Rebecca began setting up her rifle 2 lanes down from his position. "Colonel Peterson, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Yesterday, when you said you recognized someone who'd been there, what did you mean?" Peterson lowered his rifle and looked at her directly. "I mean, I've seen enough soldiers to know the difference between someone who's faced real combat and someone who's just playing dress-up." He paused. "I also mean, I've seen enough cover-ups and scapegoating to recognize when someone's being railroaded." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. "The classified nature of my final mission means I can't defend myself publicly. Even if I could, who would believe me over established rumors?" "Maybe more people than you think." Peterson nodded toward the main pavilion. "See that man talking to Harrison? Grey suit, serious expression?" Rebecca spotted him, an older gentleman, in civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. "That's General Marcus Webb, retired. He's one of the championship's major sponsors, and he was also theater commander in Afghanistan during your deployment window." Peterson's voice dropped. "If anyone has access to the real story about what happened to your unit, it would be him." Before Rebecca could respond, Brian Thompson's voice carried across the morning air from the adjacent practice range. "I'm just saying, people have a right to know who they're competing against," he was telling a group of range officials and competitors. "If someone has a history of choking under pressure, especially when lives were on the line, that's relevant information." Range Officer Dennis nodded eagerly. "Safety is our top concern. Can't have someone with documented issues handling firearms in a high-stress environment." Rebecca felt her jaw clench. The lies were becoming more elaborate and specific with each telling. Soon people would start believing them simply through repetition. "That's interesting," came a new voice, crisp, authoritative, and unfamiliar. Everyone turned to see General Webb approaching, his expression unreadable. Colonel Harrison walked beside him, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Documented issues, you said?" Webb's steel-grey eyes fixed on Dennis. "I'd be very interested in seeing that documentation." Dennis shifted nervously. "Well, it's not official documentation exactly. More like reliable reports from people who were there." "I see. And these reliable people? They've signed statements, testified under oath, submitted formal reports through proper military channels?" The group exchanged uncertain glances. Brian Thompson stepped forward, apparently deciding to brazen it out. "General, with all due respect, sometimes the truth doesn't come through official channels. Soldiers protect their own even when—" "Son," Webb interrupted, his voice dropping several degrees in temperature, "I've been in the army longer than you've been breathing. I know exactly how truth moves through military channels, and I know bullshit when I hear it." He turned to survey the suddenly silent group. "Sergeant First Class Rebecca Martinez," he continued, "served with distinction in multiple combat deployments. Her final mission involved classified operations that I'm not at liberty to discuss. But I will say this much. Any rumors suggesting cowardice or failure on her part are not just wrong. They're insulting to the memory of the soldiers she helped save." Rebecca felt the air rush out of her lungs. Someone who knew the truth was finally speaking up, and that someone carried enough authority to make people listen. Brian's face had gone pale. "General, the information I received seemed credible." "The information you received," Webb said coldly, "was gossip. Malicious gossip designed to damage a decorated veteran's reputation. I suggest you focus on your own shooting and leave military personnel matters to people who actually understand them." He turned to Range Officer Dennis. "As for documented safety concerns, I'd be happy to review Sergeant Martinez's actual military record with the championship director, unless, of course, you have evidence beyond locker room rumors." Dennis shook his head quickly. "No, sir. No official documentation." "Then I suggest this conversation ends here." Webb's gaze swept the group one final time. Permanently. As the crowd dispersed, Webb approached Rebecca directly. "Sergeant Martinez, a word, if you please." They walked a short distance from the firing line, out of earshot of the others. "General, Rebecca began, but Webb held up a hand. "I know what happened in Kandahar," he said quietly. "The real story, not the rumors. What you did that night saved 11 American lives, including your spotter, who was badly wounded. The 2 soldiers your unit lost died in the initial IED blast before your team even reached the Overwatch position." Rebecca's vision blurred. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of those deaths, wondering if she could have done something different, something better. The after-action report was classified because it revealed intelligence sources and methods, but your conduct was exemplary throughout. You have nothing to be ashamed of. "Then why was I discharged?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you requested it," Webb replied gently. "Survivor's guilt is common among combat veterans, especially snipers who carry the burden of life-and-death decisions. Your commanding officer noted that you'd become reluctant to engage targets even when tactically justified." Rebecca nodded. It was true. After Kandahar, every time she'd looked through her scope at a potential threat, she'd seen the faces of her fallen teammates. The precision that had once been automatic became hesitant, uncertain. "PTSD isn't failure, Sergeant. It's a normal response to abnormal circumstances. The fact that you're here, competing at this level, tells me you've done the hard work of healing." "Thank you, sir. That means everything." Webb smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. "Now I understand you have some long-range shooting to do. I suggest you show these people what real precision looks like." The 800-yard event began an hour later. The targets seemed impossibly small through the heat mirage, and the wind conditions were constantly shifting. This was where raw talent separated from mechanical competence. Rebecca settled into her shooting position with a calm she hadn't felt in days. General Webb's words had lifted a burden she'd carried for years, and for the first time since arriving. In Texas, she felt truly free to shoot without the weight of shame and doubt. Her first shot at 800 yards landed in the X-ring, drawing appreciative murmurs from the grandstand. Her second shot was even better, if such a thing were possible, so close to dead center that the judges had to use special measuring tools to determine the exact score. By her fifth shot, the range had fallen silent, except for the wind whistling through the grandstands. Rebecca's grouping was so tight that all 5 bullets could be covered by a quarter. It was the kind of shooting that separated professionals from amateurs, and everyone present knew it. Brian Thompson, shooting 2 lanes over, was clearly struggling with the distance and conditions. His shots were scattered across the target, some barely in the scoring rings. The contrast was impossible to ignore. When scores were posted, Rebecca had achieved something that would be talked about for years. A perfect score at 800 yards with the smallest group measurement in championship history. The crowd erupted in genuine applause, not the polite clapping she'd received before, but the thunderous recognition of witnessing something extraordinary. Colonel Peterson caught her eye and nodded with unmistakable pride. Even some of the competitors, who'd been whispering about her earlier, approached to offer congratulations. The shooting, at least, was speaking louder than the rumors. But as Rebecca packed her rifle, she noticed Brian Thompson deep in conversation with Range Officer Dennis and several other officials. Whatever they were discussing, their expressions were serious, and their glances in her direction frequent and hostile. The war might have just entered a new phase, but Rebecca finally had the ammunition to fight back. Part 5. The Desperate Gambit. The evening brought unexpected visitors to Rebecca's hotel room. A soft knock at her door revealed Colonel Harrison and General Webb, both looking uncharacteristically grim. "May we come in?" Harrison asked. "We need to discuss a serious matter." Rebecca stepped aside, her stomach already knotting with apprehension. The two senior officers settled into the room's small sitting area, their military bearing making the civilian furniture seem inadequate. "There's been a formal complaint filed against you," Harrison began without preamble. "Mr. Thompson has alleged that you're using performance-enhancing substances." Rebecca's mouth fell open. That's ridiculous. I've never—" "We know," Webb interrupted gently. "But he's demanded that you submit to immediate drug testing, and he's raised enough doubt among the other competitors that we're obligated to address it. He's also claiming your equipment might be modified beyond regulation standards," Harrison added. "Something about your scope having illegal enhancements." Rebecca sank into a chair, the magnitude of Brian's escalation hitting her fully. He wasn't just trying to psychologically intimidate her anymore, he was attempting to have her disqualified on technical grounds. "There's more," Webb said, his expression darkening. "He's contacted several military personnel claiming to be investigating your service record for a book he's supposedly writing. He's been spreading the Afghanistan rumors to anyone who will listen, trying to build a case that you're mentally unstable." "Can he do that?" Rebecca asked, feeling the walls closing in. "The drug test is legitimate," Harrison replied. "Competition. Rules allow any participant to request testing if they have reasonable suspicion. As for the equipment inspection, that's also within the rules." "However," Webb interjected, "his attempts to investigate your classified military record could constitute a violation of federal law. I've made some calls to ensure that stops immediately." Rebecca stood and began pacing the small room. "He's trying to destroy me on every front. Performance, equipment, mental state, military record. Even if I pass every test, the mere accusation damages my reputation." "Which is exactly his intent," Harrison said. "Thompson has done this before, though never quite so aggressively. 3 years ago, he forced a competitor from Montana into early retirement through similar tactics. The man was cleared of all allegations, but the stress destroyed his competitive career." "The question," Webb said, studying Rebecca carefully, "is how you want to handle this. We can arrange for the tests to be conducted quickly and quietly, or we can make a public spectacle of Thompson's accusations." Rebecca stopped pacing. "What do you mean, public spectacle?" "I mean we hold a press conference," Harrison explained. "Let Thompson make his accusations in front of cameras and reporters, force him to provide evidence for his claims, make him own the consequences of his harassment campaign." "That's a risky strategy," Webb warned. "If even one of his allegations had merit, it could end your competitive career permanently. But if they're all baseless, which we believe they are, it could expose him as the vindictive fraud he is." Rebecca considered her options. The safe play was to submit to quiet testing, prove her innocence, and continue competing. But that would leave Brian free to target the next competitor who threatened his ego. "I want the press conference," she said finally. "If I run from this fight, he'll just find another victim." Maybe it's time someone stood up to him publicly. Harrison and Webb exchanged glances. "You're sure?" Harrison asked. "Once we go public, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, before the 1,000-yard event," Webb replied. "That gives us tonight to prepare." After the ball, 2 officers left. Rebecca called her former squad leader, Mike Rodriguez. "Rebecca, how's the competition going?" "Complicated," she replied, then explained the situation. Mike was quiet for a long moment. "That bastard contacted me yesterday asking questions about Kandahar. I told him to go pound sand, but..." He paused. "Rebecca, some of the newer guys in the unit don't know the real story. They might have talked." "What could they have told him? They weren't there." "No, but they've heard the sanitized version, the one that makes it sound like we lost people due to operational failures rather than enemy action. Without the classified details, it's easy to misinterpret." Rebecca felt her heart sink. "So he might actually have statements from soldiers?" "Probably, but they'd be statements from people who don't know what really happened. I can get you sworn affidavits from the guys who were actually there, the ones who know you saved their lives." "How quickly?" "Give me until morning. I'll wake up half of Fort Bragg if I have to." The next morning dawned clear and cold, unusual for Texas in late summer. Rebecca arrived at the range to find a cluster of news vehicles parked near the main entrance. Word had leaked about the press conference, and reporters were already setting up equipment. Colonel Peterson appeared at her side. "Ready for this circus?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Rebecca replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Remember what I told you about pressure," Peterson said quietly. "This isn't life or death. This is just noise." The press conference was held in the main pavilion with Harrison serving as moderator. Television cameras lined the back wall and reporters filled the folding chairs. Rebecca sat at a table facing the audience, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the bright lights. Brian Thompson was conspicuously absent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, "we're here to address recent allegations made against competitor Rebecca Martinez. Rather than handle these matters privately, Ms. Martinez has requested a public forum to respond to the accusations." A reporter immediately raised her hand. "What specific allegations are we talking about?" Harrison consulted his notes. "Mr. Thompson has formally accused Ms. Martinez of using performance-enhancing drugs, equipment violations, and has questioned her mental fitness based on her military service record." "Where is Mr. Thompson?" another reporter asked. "Shouldn't he be here to present his evidence?" "Mr. Thompson was invited to attend but declined to participate," Harrison replied diplomatically. Rebecca leaned toward her microphone. "I'd like to address each allegation directly," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "First, regarding performance-enhancing drugs, I consent to immediate blood and urine testing by any certified laboratory. I have never used illegal substances, and I welcome the opportunity to prove it." She paused, gathering courage for the next part. "Second, regarding equipment violations, my rifle and scope are available for inspection by any qualified expert. Every modification was made according to manufacturer specifications and competition rules." The part was coming. "Finally, regarding my military service, I served with honor in Afghanistan and was discharged at my own request due to combat-related PTSD. The mission Mr. Thompson has been investigating was classified, but I have permission from Army leadership to share certain details." She looked directly into the camera. "On the night in question, My unit was tasked with overwatch during a high-value target operation. We came under enemy attack before reaching our position. 2 soldiers died in the initial IED blast. From an emergency position, I provided covering, fire that allowed 11 wounded soldiers to be evacuated safely. Far from choking under pressure, I performed my duties under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. A murmur ran through the assembled reporters. This was clearly not the narrative they'd been expecting. I have sworn statements from 5 soldiers who were present that night, testifying to these facts, Rebecca continued, holding up a folder Mike Rodriguez had delivered that morning. I also have my official commendation for valor under fire, awarded for actions on that same mission. The questions came rapidly after that, but Rebecca answered each one with growing confidence. The truth, it turned out, was a powerful weapon. As the press conference ended, Rebecca noticed Range Officer Dennis slipping out the back door. His face was pale and he was talking urgently into his cell phone. General Webb approached as the reporters packed up their equipment. "Well handled," he said quietly. "You may have just ended Thompson's competitive career." "What do you mean?" "I mean that several sponsors are very unhappy about this situation. Harassment campaigns are bad for business, especially when they target veterans. Thompson may find himself unwelcome at future events." As if summoned by their conversation, Brian Thompson appeared in the pavilion doorway. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by barely controlled fury. "Enjoy your moment, Martinez," he called out, his voice carrying across the emptying room. "But this isn't over. I know people. I have connections. Your little press conference won't save you when it really matters." "Mr. Thompson," General Webb stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "I suggest you consider your next words very carefully. Making threats against a fellow competitor could result in immediate disqualification." Brian's face flushed red, but he said nothing more. He turned and stalked out, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. "He's not done," Rebecca said quietly. "No," Webb agreed. "But now everyone's watching. His next move will have to be subtle, which isn't his strength." The drug test results came back clean, as expected. The equipment inspection found no violations, but Rebecca knew the real test was still coming, the 1,000-yard precision event that would determine the championship rankings. As she prepared her rifle for the longest shots of the competition, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Brian Thompson was planning something desperate. Men like him didn't back down gracefully, and cornered animals were always most dangerous. The question wasn't whether he would strike again, but when and how, and whether she would be ready for it. The 1,000-yard event began under overcast skies that made reading wind conditions nearly impossible. At this distance, a 5-mile-per-hour wind shift could mean the difference between a bullseye and a complete miss. Only 12 competitors remained in contention for the championship title, and the tension was palpable. Rebecca drew lane 6, which put her uncomfortably close to Brian Thompson in lane 3. She could hear him talking loudly to his spotters about wind calls and elevation adjustments, but something in his tone suggested the conversation was for her benefit rather than tactical necessity. "That crosswind at 400 yards is murder," he said pointedly. "Course, some people might not pick up on the subtleties. Takes years of experience to read conditions like this properly." Rebecca ignored the jab and focused on her rifle setup. 1,000 yards, every detail mattered. Scope alignment, rifle cant, even the consistency of her cheek welled against the stock. She'd made shots at this distance under combat conditions, but never with this level of precision required. Colonel Peterson had positioned himself in the spotting area, serving as her unofficial coach. Through hand signals, he indicated wind conditions that largely matched her own observations. Light and variable, shifting between 5 and 8 miles per hour from the northwest. "Shooters, you have 20 minutes for sighting shots," announced. The range officer, not Dennis, Rebecca noticed, but an older man she didn't recognize. Her first sighting shot landed 2 inches high and 3 inches left of center. She made a scope adjustment and fired again. This shot was closer, just 1 inch high and centered for windage. A final adjustment brought her point of impact to dead center. Through her peripheral vision, she could see Brian struggling with his sighting shots. His grouping was scattered across a 6-inch area, suggesting he was either fighting equipment problems or failing to read the wind correctly. "Sighting period complete. Prepare for record fire." Rebecca settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as the familiar calm descended. This was the zone she'd learned to access in combat, where time slowed, distractions faded, and only the target mattered. "Ready on the right! Ready on the left! Ready on the firing line!" The range fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the grass. "Commence firing!" Rebecca's first shot felt perfect from the moment she squeezed the trigger. The recoil was straight back, the follow-through smooth. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's trace and saw it impact dead center in the X-ring. Her second shot was equally precise, landing less than half an inch from the first. She was building what snipers called a ragged hole, multiple shots impacting so close together that they appeared to be a single, larger hole. By her fourth shot, word had spread through the grandstand that something special was happening. She could hear the excited murmur of spectators, but it seemed to come from very far away. Her entire world had narrowed to the circle of her scope and the distant target. Her fifth and final shot completed what would later be called the greatest single group in championship history, 5 shots at 1,000 yards covered by a measurement smaller than a dime. The ceasefire was called, and Rebecca finally allowed herself to breathe. Around her, other competitors were staring at her target through spotting scopes, their expressions ranging from amazement to disbelief. "Holy hell," someone whispered. "That's impossible." Brian Thompson was not among the admirers. His own target showed a respectable but unspectacular grouping, the kind of shooting that would score well but not spectacularly. His face was dark with barely controlled rage as he stared at Rebecca's perfect group. As the scores were being calculated, Range Officer Dennis suddenly reappeared, approaching Rebecca's lane with obvious purpose. "Ms. Martinez, I need to inspect your ammunition," he announced loudly enough for nearby competitors to hear. Rebecca frowned. "My ammunition?" "Routine check for compliance with competition standards. Please produce all remaining cartridges from the lot you used for this event." This was highly irregular. Ammunition checks were typically done before competition, not after exceptional performance. But Rebecca complied, producing the box of match-grade cartridges she'd been using all week. Dennis examined each cartridge with theatrical attention, using calipers to measure case lengths and bullet weights. "These measurements seem unusual," he announced. "I'm going to need to send these to an independent laboratory for analysis." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Colonel Peterson had approached, his expression dangerous. "I'm not suggesting anything," Dennis replied. "I'm following proper procedures for suspicious performance anomalies." "Suspicious?" Peterson's voice had dropped to the tone that had once commanded attention from enemy forces. "The only thing suspicious here is your timing." General Webb appeared as if materialized from thin air. "Officer Dennis, what seems to be the problem?" "Sir, this competitor has achieved statistically impossible accuracy. I'm required to investigate potential equipment or ammunition irregularities." "I see. And this investigation, when was it requested?" Dennis hesitated. "Well, it wasn't formally requested, but—" "Then by whose authority are you conducting it?" I thought it was appropriate, given the circumstances." Webb's expression could have frozen lava. you thought. I see. He turned to Colonel Harrison, who had also joined the gathering crowd. James, is Officer Dennis empowered to initiate equipment investigations without formal complaints or supervisory approval? Harrison consulted his rulebook. No, sir. Such investigations require either a formal complaint from another competitor or approval from the championship director. Has such a complaint been filed? Not that I am aware of. Webb turned back to Dennis. Then I suggest you return Ms. Martinez's ammunition and focus on your assigned duties, unless, of course, you have evidence of actual wrongdoing rather than mere suspicion of excellence. As Dennis reluctantly returned her ammunition, Rebecca caught sight of Brian Thompson hurrying away from the area. The timing of Dennis's random inspection was starting to make sense. But the real shock came an hour later when the final scores were posted. Rebecca had won the 1,000-yard event by the largest margin in championship history. Her score was so far ahead of the second-place finisher that it seemed like a typographical error. More importantly, her overall standings now put her in first place going into the final day's events. The grandstand erupted when her name appeared at the top of the leaderboard. For the first time since arriving in Texas, Rebecca heard genuine cheers rather than polite applause. Even competitors who'd been cool toward her earlier offered congratulations. But Brian Thompson was nowhere to be seen. That evening, Rebecca was having dinner in the hotel restaurant when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Rebecca Martinez. Ms. Martinez, this is Janet Coleman from Channel 8 News. I'm calling about some information we've received regarding your military service. Rebecca's blood went cold. What kind of information? We've been contacted by a source claiming to have documentation that contradicts the statements you made at yesterday's press conference, specifically regarding the circumstances of your discharge from the Army. What documentation? I'd rather not discuss details over the phone. Could you meet with me tonight? I want to give you a chance to respond before we air the story. Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in. Brian wasn't giving up. He was escalating to nuclear options. Where and when? She asked. The hotel lobby in 1 hour. I'll be wearing a blue suit. After hanging up, Rebecca immediately called General Webb. General, we have a problem. As she explained the situation, she could hear Webb's anger building. That son of a bitch is really going for broke, he muttered. Rebecca, whatever this reporter thinks she has, I guarantee it's either forged or taken completely out of context. Should I meet with her? Absolutely, but not alone. I'll be there, and so will a military lawyer I know in Dallas. If Thompson wants to play with fire, he's about to get burned. An hour later, the hotel lobby had become an impromptu war room. Janet Coleman turned out to be a serious journalist with a reputation for thorough investigation. The documents she'd received were photocopies of what appeared to be official Army paperwork, suggesting Rebecca had been investigated for conduct unbecoming an officer. General Webb examined the papers with growing fury. These are forgeries, he said flatly. Poorly executed forgeries based on real letterhead, but completely fabricated content. How can you be sure? Coleman asked. Because I signed the real paperwork authorizing Sergeant Martinez's discharge. This, he held up one of the documents, shows my signature from 2019 on a document dated 2021. Also, the formatting is wrong. The case numbers don't match Army standards, and the allegations described here never appeared in any official investigation because no investigation was ever conducted. Coleman studied the papers again. So you're saying someone deliberately created false documents? I'm saying someone committed federal crimes, Webb replied coldly. Forging military documents is a felony. So is impersonating a military officer, which whoever created these would have had to do to obtain the letterhead. The lawyer Webb had brought, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hendricks, leaned forward. "Ms. Coleman, I assume you received these documents from the same source who's been spreading rumors about my client's military service?" Coleman nodded. He claimed to be researching a book about military accountability. Did he provide any credentials? Any proof of legitimate, journalistic or academic purpose? Well, no, but then you've been the victim of a criminal conspiracy, Hendricks said bluntly. Someone has used you to spread defamatory material based on forged documents. I strongly suggest you investigate your source as thoroughly as you've investigated my client. As the meeting ended, Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the broader pattern was clear. Brian Thompson was willing to do anything, including commit federal crimes, to destroy her. "He's not going to stop," she told Webb as they walked to the elevator. "No," Webb agreed, "but he's also running out of ammunition, and after tonight, he's crossed lines that even his supporters won't be able to ignore." The final day of competition would bring the ultimate test, not just of marksmanship skills, but of nerves, character, and the ability to perform under pressure that had nothing to do with shooting and everything to do with surviving a war of attrition. Rebecca fell asleep that night knowing that tomorrow would either vindicate everything she'd fought for or end her competitive career in flames. There was no middle ground left. The battlefield was set for one last engagement. The championship's final day dawned with unseasonable storms brewing on the horizon. Dark clouds gathered in the west, and the wind had shifted to come from multiple directions, the worst possible conditions for precision shooting. Only 6 competitors remained in contention for the overall title, with Rebecca holding a slim lead over 2 international shooters and 3 Americans, including Brian Thompson. Rebecca arrived at the range to find news vehicles lining the access road. Word of the previous night's document forgery scandal had leaked, and reporters were eager for updates. She slipped in through a side entrance, hoping to avoid the media circus until after the competition. The final event was a grueling test designed to simulate real-world sniping conditions, 5 targets at distances ranging from 300 to 1,200 yards, engaging each within strict time limits while moving between shooting positions. It was the kind of challenge that separated true marksmen from range shooters. Colonel Peterson met her at the equipment check station. "How are you holding up?" "Ready to end this," Rebecca replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Good, 'cause Thompson's been busy this morning." Rebecca followed his gaze toward the competitor staging area where Brian was surrounded by a cluster of officials and what appeared to be lawyers. His voice carried clearly across the morning air. "I'm simply asking for fairness," he was saying. "Given the questionable circumstances surrounding her recent performances, I think additional scrutiny is warranted." General Webb appeared at Rebecca's shoulder. "He's filed a formal protest, claiming your rifle has been illegally modified between events. He's demanding a complete disassembly and inspection before you're allowed to compete." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. "Can he do that?" "Technically, yes. Competition rules allow for equipment protests, though they're rarely used and almost never upheld." Webb's expression was grim. "The problem is timing. The inspection would take at least 2 hours, which means you'd miss the final event entirely." "That's the point," Peterson said flatly. "He can't beat you shooting, so he's trying to keep you from shooting at all." As they talked, Range Officer Dennis approached with obvious reluctance. "Ms. Martinez, I'm required to inform you that a formal equipment protest has been filed. Your rifle must be inspected before you can compete in the final event." "By whom?" Webb demanded. "By By the head range officer and a certified gunsmith, Dennis replied, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. And where is this certified gunsmith? Well, he's on his way. Should be here within the hour. Rebecca studied Dennis's face and saw something that hadn't been there before. Shame. Whatever Brian had talked him into, he was beginning to realize he'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Officer Dennis, she said quietly, you know this protest is frivolous. You've inspected my rifle 3 times this week. You know it's completely legal. Dennis wouldn't meet her eyes. I have to follow proper procedures. Even when those procedures are being manipulated by someone with a personal vendetta. I just follow the rules. Colonel Harrison approached, looking harried and frustrated. Rebecca, I'm sorry about this. The protest has been filed in accordance with competition rules, so I'm obligated to have your equipment inspected. But I want you to know that this is highly irregular and the timing is suspicious. Rebecca nodded, feeling the familiar calm that preceded major decisions. Colonel, how long do I have to produce an alternative rifle for inspection? Harrison consulted his rulebook. Alternative equipment must be presented within 30 minutes of the original protest filing. Why? Because I have a backup rifle in my hotel room, same make and model, identical specifications. If Mr. Thompson wants to play games with equipment, protests, let's see how he handles competing against 2 legal rifles instead of trying to eliminate one. Webb's face lit up with understanding. Brilliant. He's expecting you to be tied up in bureaucratic delays. Instead, you'll be shooting while he's stuck, explaining why he's so afraid of fair competition. 30 minutes later, Rebecca returned, with her backup rifle, a nearly identical Remington 700 that she'd brought as insurance against equipment failure. The irony wasn't lost on her that Brian's attempt at sabotage had actually given her a psychological advantage. While he'd been plotting legal maneuvers, she'd been mentally preparing for the most important shooting of her life. The final event began with competitors drawing numbers for shooting order. Rebecca drew position 4 out of 6, not ideal, but workable. Brian drew the final position, which meant he'd shoot with full knowledge of what scores he needed to beat. The first competitor, a German sniper with an international reputation, struggled with the shifting wind conditions. His score was respectable but not spectacular. The second shooter, an American from Montana, fared better but missed his longest range target entirely. The third competitor was Maria Santos, a Spanish police sniper who'd been quietly impressive throughout the competition. She moved through the course with mechanical precision, landing solid hits on 4 of 5 targets before barely missing the 1,200-yard shot due to a sudden wind shift. Then it was Rebecca's time. She approached the first shooting position, 300 yards, standing position, with the kind of focus she'd learned in combat. The target was large at this distance, but the time pressure and requirement to move quickly between positions added complexity. Her first shot was perfect, dead center in the X-ring. She immediately began moving toward the second position while ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. The 500-yard target required shooting from behind a concrete barrier that simulated urban conditions. Rebecca settled into position, read the wind, and fired. Another center hit. Moving to the 800-yard position, she could hear murmurs from the grandstand. Her pace was faster than the previous competitors, but her accuracy remained flawless. The 800-yard shot was taken from a prone position, and her bullet found the 10 ring with room to spare. The 1,000-yard target was where most competitors had struggled. The distance was extreme, and the wind had become increasingly erratic as the storm system approached. Rebecca took extra time reading conditions, waiting for a lull in the gusting wind. When the moment came, she fired without hesitation. The bullet's flight seemed to take forever, but when it struck the target, the distinctive sound of a center hit echoed across the range. One target remained, 1,200 yards, the longest shot of the entire championship. Rebecca approached the final position, knowing that Brian Thompson was watching her every move, calculating what score he'd need to overcome her lead. The target at 1,200 yards was barely visible through the scope, and the wind was now gusting to nearly 15 miles per hour. She settled into position and began reading the conditions. This wasn't just about accuracy anymore. It was about proving that excellence couldn't be destroyed by politics, harassment, or dirty tricks. Her spotter, Colonel Peterson, called outwind estimates through hand signals, but ultimately the shot was hers alone to make. Rebecca controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger with the same deliberate pressure she'd used 100 times in combat. The bullet's flight time at 1,200 yards was nearly 2 seconds, an eternity in precision shooting. Through her scope, she watched the trace and saw the impact. Dead center. Perfect hit. The grandstand erupted in cheers that could be heard over the approaching thunder. Rebecca had achieved something unprecedented. Perfect. Scores on all 5 targets under the most challenging conditions of the entire championship. As she packed her rifle, Brian Thompson approached for his final run. His face was pale, and his earlier swagger had been replaced by the desperate intensity of a man facing inevitable defeat. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he said quietly as he passed her position. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Rebecca replied calmly. "It's been over since the first day when you decided to attack someone's character instead of trusting your own skills." Brian's final performance was adequate but uninspired. The pressure of needing perfect scores to win had clearly affected his shooting, and he missed 2 of the 5 targets. His final score left him in 4th place overall, respectable, but nowhere near championship level. When the final scores were announced, Rebecca Martinez had won the International Sniper Championship by the largest margin in the event's history. More importantly, she'd done it while facing a level of harassment and sabotage that would have broken most competitors. As she stood on the podium accepting the championship trophy, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her here. The lies, the forged documents, the attempts at disqualification, all of it had failed because truth and skill were stronger than malice and manipulation. Brian Thompson was notably absent from the ceremony. Word later spread that he'd been escorted from the facility by security after making threats towards several officials. His competitive career, built on intimidation and dirty tricks, had finally collapsed under the weight of its own toxicity. The real victory, Rebecca realized, wasn't the trophy or the title. It was the knowledge that she'd faced the worst that hatred and jealousy could throw at her, and emerged stronger than ever. 6 months after the championship, Rebecca Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at Fort Bragg, delivering the keynote address at a conference on veteran reintegration. The trophy from Dallas sat on a shelf in her apartment, but the real prize had been something far more valuable, the return of her confidence and the knowledge that her service had meant something. "The most important shot I ever made," she told the audience of soldiers, veterans, and military families, "wasn't the one that won the championship. It was the one I almost didn't take. The decision to compete in the first place." The invitation to speak had come from General Webb, who'd become an unexpected mentor in the months following her victory. The scandal surrounding Brian Thompson's harassment campaign had led to widespread changes in competitive shooting, with new policies protecting participants from intimidation and requiring background checks for range officials. Brian himself had vanished from the competitive circuit entirely. The FBI investigation into the forged documents had led to federal charges, and his reputation in the shooting community was permanently destroyed. Range Officer Dennis had been terminated and banned from future events after admitting he'd been paid to target Rebecca with unnecessary equipment checks and delays. But the most satisfying outcome had been the letters. Dozens of them had arrived in the weeks after the championship, from female veterans who'd felt inspired to pursue their own goals, from young women interested in competitive shooting, from military families who'd struggled with PTSD and guilt. Rebecca had answered everyone personally, understanding that her victory had become something larger than a shooting competition. "The enemy isn't always across a battlefield," she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "Sometimes it's in the mirror, in the voice that tells you you're not good enough, not strong enough, not worth defending. Learning to silence that voice is the most important marksmanship skill any of us can develop." In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Colonel Peterson had driven down from Virginia, and several of her former squad mates from Afghanistan had taken leave to attend. Mike Rodriguez sat in the front row, grinning with obvious pride. After the speech, Rebecca was approached by a young woman in army fatigues, a specialist who couldn't have been more than 22. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you," the soldier said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been dealing with some harassment in my unit, guys saying women don't belong in combat roles. After hearing about what you went through, I finally filed a formal complaint. The harassment stopped." Rebecca felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. "You did that yourself, specialist. You just needed to remember that you had the right to fight back." As the evening wound down, Rebecca found herself standing alone in the parking lot, looking up at the same North Carolina stars she'd gazed at during her years of service. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw your speech online. Inspiring stuff. Would love to interview you for a documentary about veterans in competitive sports. Are you interested?" She smiled and typed back her reply. "Let's talk." The drive back to her apartment took her past the training ranges where she'd first learned to shoot as a young soldier. The circle was complete, but somehow it felt more like a beginning than an ending. Her apartment had changed since the championship. The walls now held framed photographs from the competition, letters from grateful veterans, and a certificate from the Army acknowledging her contributions to veteran advocacy. The trophy sat quietly on its shelf, impressive, but no longer the most important thing in the room. The most important thing was the notebook on her desk, filled with ideas for the veteran mentorship program she was developing. The program would focus on competitive shooting as a way to rebuild confidence and community among former service members struggling with civilian life. Rebecca opened the notebook and began writing. "Excellence isn't about being better than others. It's about being better than the person you were yesterday, and having the courage to prove it when everything is working against you." She paused, thinking about the blindfolded exhibition shots that had become legendary in competitive shooting circles. 10 consecutive bullseyes without sight, each shot dedicated to a fallen comrade. The demonstration had been about more than marksmanship. It had been about trust, memory, and the invisible bonds that connect all who've served. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her mother's number. "Hi, Mom. Rebecca, honey. I just watched your speech online. I'm so proud of you." Her mother's voice carried the same warmth that had sustained Rebecca through the darkest periods of her military service. "Thanks, Mum. It felt good to finally tell the whole story. Your father would have been so proud. He always said you had the heart of a warrior, even as a little girl." Rebecca smiled, remembering her father's patient lessons on their family farm, teaching her to shoot tin cans off fence posts with an old .22 rifle. He'd passed away during her second deployment, and she'd always regretted that he never got to see her competitive success. "I'm thinking of coming home for a visit next month," Rebecca said. Maybe we could go out to the old range, shoot some cans like we used to." "I'd love that, sweetheart." "And Rebecca? I know these past few years have been hard, but you never stopped fighting. That's what matters." After hanging up, Rebecca returned to her notebook, but her thoughts drifted to the future. The championship had opened doors she'd never expected: sponsorship offers, speaking engagements, even a possible coaching position with the Olympic development team. But the opportunity that excited her most was the call she'd received from the Army Special Operations Command. They wanted her to develop a new sniper training program, one that incorporated the psychological resilience techniques she'd learned from overcoming harassment and adversity. The program would train not just marksmen, but leaders who could perform under pressure and support their teammates through the worst conditions imaginable. It was a chance to turn her pain into purpose, her experience into expertise. Rebecca closed the notebook and walked to her bedroom window. In the distance, she could see the lights of Fort Bragg, where her military journey had begun nearly a decade ago. Tomorrow she would drive onto that base not as a broken veteran seeking help, but as a champion returning to serve. The competitive shooting circuit would continue without her regular presence, but she would remain involved as a mentor and advocate. There were other Rebecca Martinezes out there, talented women facing discrimination, veterans struggling with doubt, underdogs being written off by people who'd never faced real challenges. They would need someone to show them that excellence was possible, that character mattered more than politics, and that the hardest targets to hit were often the ones that required the most courage to attempt. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd arrived in Dallas 6 months ago. Stronger, calmer, more certain of her place in the world. She thought about Brian Thompson one last time, not with anger, but with something approaching pity. He'd spent so much energy trying to tear others down that he'd forgotten to build himself up. His legacy would be measured in the careers he'd tried to destroy, while hers would be measured in the lives she'd helped rebuild. The championship trophy caught the lamplight as she turned off the bedroom light. Tomorrow it would go into storage, making room for new goals and different victories. The real prize, the knowledge that she belonged wherever her skills and character could take her, would stay with her forever. Rebecca Martinez fell asleep that night with the kind of peace that comes only to those who've faced their demons and emerged victorious. Outside her window, the North Carolina night was quiet, except for the distant sound of training exercises on the base. Somewhere in those sounds were the echoes of future champions, future leaders, future warriors who would need to learn the same lesson she'd learned in Dallas. That true marksmanship isn't about hitting targets, but about having the courage to aim for them in the first place. The blindfolded shots that had made her famous were really about trust. Trust in her training, her instincts, and her ability to perform when she couldn't see the outcome. It was a metaphor for everything that mattered in life. Sometimes you had to take the shot without knowing exactly where it would land, trusting that your preparation and character would guide you true. As dawn broke over Fort Bragg, Rebecca Martinez began planning her next mission, helping other veterans find their way home, one shot at a time. The story that had begun with harassment and doubt had ended with purpose and hope. And in the quiet confidence of a new day, Rebecca knew that her best shooting was still ahead of her. Epilogue. 1 year later, the headline in the Army Times read, "Former sniper champion launches revolutionary training program." Below it was a photograph of Rebecca Martinez instructing a mixed class of male and female soldiers at a newly constructed training facility. The Martinez method, as it had come to be known, combined technical marksmanship with psychological resilience training. Students learned not just how to shoot accurately, but how to maintain performance under verbal harassment, equipment failures, and impossible time pressure. The program's graduation rate was the highest in Army Special Operations history, and its graduates were already making their mark in units around the world. More importantly, complaints of harassment and discrimination in sniper training had dropped to near zero wherever the program was implemented. Brian Thompson's name had become a cautionary tale in competitive shooting circles, a reminder of how talent without character inevitably leads to self-destruction. He'd served 6 months in federal prison for the document forgery scheme and now worked at a sporting goods store in a small Texas town, his competitive dreams permanently shattered. Rebecca's mother visited the training facility every few months, always bringing homemade cookies for the students and beaming with pride as she watched her daughter teach the next generation of warriors. And on the wall of Rebecca's office, next to her championship trophy and service medals, hung a simple wooden plaque with words that had guided her through the darkest moments of her journey. Once a warrior, always a warrior. The battlefield may change, but the mission remains the same. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, and never, ever surrender. Below that, in smaller letters, was a quote from her championship speech that had been picked up by news outlets around the world. Excellence isn't about being better than others. It's about being better than the person you were yesterday, and having the courage to prove it when everything is working against you. Every morning, Rebecca read those words before beginning her day. And every evening, as she watched her students master skills that would one day save lives, she knew that the hardest shot she'd ever taken, the decision to fight back against injustice, had been the most important bullseye of her life. The woman who had once stood alone on a hostile firing line now stood at the center of a community dedicated to excellence, integrity, and the belief that true champions are forged not by easy victories, but by the courage to aim true when the whole world expects you to miss. Her story had become their story, and their success had become her greatest triumph. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Share your own stories of overcoming adversity or standing up to bullies. Remember, every champion starts with a single decision to never give up. Until next time, keep aiming for excellence.